They passed every test, they broke every record, and the Navy punished them with silence. A manila envelope sealed. Top secret, Negro officer candidates 1944. The flap cracks. Thin paper, clean type, ink and damp in the air. All men qualified for commission, assignments to command not due to racial policy. Silence. A wall clock, tick, tock, 13 white uniforms, hanging on wooden pegs. Nobody inside. Yet, in the middle of a war for freedom, the United States Navy created 13 officers. It would not allow to lead. Not enemies, not spies, Americans. Another label, handwritten, barely a whisper of bureaucracy, experimental. The camera drops to the lower margin. A blue stamp, Bureau of Naval Personnel, one line underlined in pencil, exceptional scores. Another, blacked out in ink, command eligibility. Listen, this isn't a story about guns overseas. It's a test America gave itself and failed. They would be called the Golden 13, gold. But gold doesn't rust. Institutions do. Breathe. Look at the uniforms again. They're ready to be worn. The question is, by whom? Cut to black. One line like a verdict. They passed every test and were punished for it. 2 documents, same day, March 17th, 1944, same signatures, opposite outcomes. The first is neat, with lists and pencil notes at the edge. All 13 candidates, distinction, leadership potential, high, commission recommended. The second, identical until the middle. Then, the wound, a black band of ink across command eligibility. It doesn't erase names. It erases a right. It shouldn't exist. But it does. In the corner, for internal routing only, in pencil, wait for guidance. Wait, to permit what? Or to deny whom? The stamp returns. Negro officer candidates, Class 44A. The hand that underlines exceptional is the same hand that drags the blackout. The paradox fits in one line, fit for insignia, unfit for command. A marginal note, sounds like routine, weighs like an anchor. Assignments restricted to non-combat administrative duties. It shouldn't exist, but it does. 2 files, 1 mirage, equality on paper, power in ink. The ocean's war roars far away. Here, the surf is bureaucratic. That's where this story begins, with men who proved equality in numbers, hours of study, flawless drills, and were buried under a black line. The frame pulls out of the file and finds their faces in a washed-out photo. No medals, straight backs, lifted chins, and a future held short. Title the anomaly as it deserves. Officers, yes. Commanders, no. Cut. Breathe. What follows isn't propaganda. It's how it should have been, and why it wasn't. Before 1944, the Navy kept accustomed with the weight of an unwritten law. It did not live in a regulation. It lived in hallways. Colored men, messman branch, galley, service, Polish until the brass hurt. Your eyes. They called it tradition. Tradition is not justice. America was fighting for freedom in 2 oceans. On board, freedom had doors, some open to the bridge, others to the pantry. In 1942-43, pressure rose. NOACP. Editorials asking, how does a democracy win with segregated decks? Letters from Congress, letters from mothers. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox opposed change. He said, this is no time to experiment. War, he argued, needs order, not internal disputes. War or custom. Knox died in 1944. His successor, James Forrestal, studied the board and cracked a slit. Pilot program, limited number, under control. Not a door, a slit. That's how Class 44A at Great Lakes Naval Training Station was born. On paper, it sounded like progress. In practice, it was an exam. 16 candidates from across the country, teachers, college students, a civil engineer, a track athlete, a band director, men who brought discipline before they saluted for the first time. They were greeted with a smile, and a limit. Separate quarters, ruthless drill, eyes on them every minute. The explicit goal, prove they can meet the officer standard. The implicit goal, prove the institution can tolerate it. How it should have been. A candidate walks in. He's taught navigation, tactics, naval law. He passes. He's given a ship, a team, a responsibility. The flag waves the same for all. How it was. A candidate walks in. He's held to +1 excellence. He passes with distinction. The record admits it. The ink denies it. Great Lakes in winter. Breath turns to steam at dawn. The chart room smells like waxed paper. Compasses, parallel rulers, problems of course and drift, fast answers. The instructor notes, remarkable precision. Stars the exercise. Smiles, with his mouth, with his eyes, he measures. Afternoon, tactics, formations, semaphore, convoy reading, rules of the road at sea, procedure on hostile contact, no privilege here, only protocol, night, manuals, light falling from cheap lamps, notebooks full of gunnery math, knots tied and untied until the skin is raw, short laughs, one phrase repeated like a charm, twice as good, to be seen as half. That line isn't written in orders, it's written on faces when an instructor walks in and scans the room. The Navy needed men. War was eating officers at a cold pace. Convoys crossed the Atlantic and the Pacific. U-boats could smell steel like sharks smell blood. Every watch officer mattered. Every course correction could save a ship. In a logical world, 13 men who shatter records become multipliers of life. But military logic crashed into social logic. The first question at sea is, do you know? The first question in the hallway is, can you, in front of them? Them, white sailors, custom, invisible chains. The Army Air Force's Tuskegee Airmen were already flying. They made mistakes, learned, won escorts. Doubt was settled in the sky. Did they protect the bombers? Yes, case closed. In the Navy, doubt was settled on paper. What will happen to morale if a black officer commands white men? They weren't seeking data. They were seeking permission. How it should have been. An admiral looks at graphs. Needs officers. Sees Class 44A notes. Exceptional. Assigns limited command. Evaluates at sea. Expands if it works. A trial, but real. How it was. An admiral looks at the same graph. Writes in the margin, non-combat administrative. Translation, don't let it show. The 44A curriculum was complete. Naval regulations, signal codes, convoy doctrine, deck gunnery instruments, legal responsibility of command, written exams, a wall of numbers in their favor, practicals, another. Great Lakes keeps records. Open the right folder, you find averages, performance notes, words that sound like science, consistency, initiative, judgment, words that sound like politics, sensitive, timing, public perception. Wars aren't won with timing. They're won with people who know and decide. And yet here the decision was to delay the obvious. How the file should have ended, commissioned, eligible for command, assigned to escort units, see evaluation at 90 days. How it actually ended. Commissioned, eligible for non-combat administrative duties, future review. The word future has an edge. It cuts the present, lets it bleed slowly. Meanwhile, 13 men walk corridors where salutes are shorter. Enter classrooms where the front row feels reserved for others. Step onto the parade ground with perfect cadence and a shorter horizon. A system's duty was simple. Align merit with responsibility. Link insignia to command. The system's desire was comfortable. Grant the insignia and withhold the command. Say yes with the right hand and not yet with the left. How it should have been isn't nostalgia, it's a mirror. Hold it up to folder 44A and you see two navies, the one that needed officers and the one that feared what those officers would reveal about itself. A country can fight two wars at once, one abroad, one inside. Class 44A trained for the first. The institution quietly enrolled them in the second. At the end of this section, return to the big map. Atlantic convoys, Pacific islands, the clock runs the same for everyone. And yet, At Great Lakes 1944, the hour came with an asterisk. How it should have sounded when that clock rang. 13 men walk to a pier, climb aboard, take a watchbook, become the answer to a real need. How it did sound. A white officer reads a list, says congratulations, then lowers his voice, adds conditions. The question ahead isn't if they were capable. That's settled. It's why, despite that, the system chose not to see it. And that why isn't at sea. It's in a room, closed door, fluorescent hum, an announcement that sounds like a patustasa prize and weighs like a resignation. Cut, breathe. We enter the arithmetic of the human, what the numbers promised, and the ink erased. Dawn, Great Lakes, frost on railings, breath like smoke. Roll call, 13 names. Boots line the asphalt, pace exact, no one late, no one average. By Bureau 600, the day already has a rhythm, charts, angles, corrections for wind and current, numbers first, course problems on the board. From Point Able to Point Baker at 12 knots, crosswind 18 knots from starboard quarter, compute new heading. Chalk squeaks, answers land fast, within tolerance, within time. Not panic, not confusion, arithmetic. Gunnery tables after that, range, elevation, time of flight. A drift correction for the breeze you don't feel on land but must feel in your bones at sea. They solve it, then solve it again, in case the proctor thinks the first time was luck. Exceptional. The pencil writes it so often the word starts to thin, like metal worked too many times. By EO 900, semaphore. Arms flash, flags cut the air like clean knives. A petty officer mutters half to himself, faster than the last class. He doesn't repeat it out loud. Mid-morning, practical navigation, dead reckoning exercises, fix by 3 bearings. An instructor watches their silence, the kind of silence where minds turn like gyros and no one performs for the room. He writes, judgment under pressure, evident, not swagger, not show. Judgment, noon, mess hall, the quiet corner table. They sit together without being told. Not a click, a shield. Trays clatter, 2 lines form, then merge again. A cook slides a plate an inch too far, like the extra distance were policy. One of the 13 folds a letter in his pocket, half written the night before. Dear Ma, I think we are going to make it, but I don't know what make it means here. Afternoon drill. Ship handling in the basin, mooring lines, engines ahead 1/3, a simulated crosswind that pushes the bow just enough to test your hands. They compensate. Fine motor memory over muscle. The instructor taps his stopwatch and nods. He will not write the nod down. Late afternoon. Law of command. Articles to memorize. The weight of a signature. The difference between a mistake and negligence. Between risk and recklessness. They quote the sections back with a steadiness that would make a judge's mouth go still. Who are you responsible for? Everyone under your authority. And if they don't want your authority? Silence, then. You still owe them safety. That answer will not fit cleanly in a report. By evening, celestial, sextants click, star tables open like atlases of the unarguable, Vega, Deneb, Altair, a triangle older than any regulation, a horizon invented by math. They take their sights. They talk in low tones about refraction and parallax and how you trust a number when a human won't. By night, study. Thin lamps, margins full, knots retied. Until fingers burn. They practice commands under breath. Left full rudder. Stand by to anchor. Belay that. They will say those words like air. They may never say them to a deck of white faces. Break. A short one. A rumor arrives the way rumors do. Half true, half smoke. Assignment lists next week. Administrative pool. No sea time yet. The words fall heavy in the room because yet means maybe never when written in careful cursive. One of them laughs, not out of humor, out of refusal to let the air freeze them. We'll ace the next test, then they'll have to see us. Another answers without looking up. They've already seen us. He underlines a formula he doesn't need. He underlines it anyway. Ritual against doubt. The numbers keep stacking. Exams, drill scores, instructor notes, a tower of evidence built brick by brick. It should be unshakable. But towers don't fall from physics in places like this. They fall from policy. A Saturday field exercise, convoy doctrine, signals to change station, rules for screen, for van, for rear guard, enemy contact protocol. They simulate a submarine periscope at 20 degrees off the bow. Commands flow from their mouths with no wobble, no stall. Come right 10 degrees. Sound general quarters. Deploy smoke to starboard. The petty officer running the scenario pauses, almost smiles, says quietly, "That'll keep you alive." Alive. The word loiters, because staying alive is why you train this hard. And because staying alive also means not becoming a story whispered in hallways. New classes will hear and pretend not to hear. They don't say the next sentence out loud. Alive is not the same as allowed. By Sunday, chapel for some. Letters out. Laundry. Shoes shined so bright a man could check his part in them. They walk the pier, not to board, just to feel boards under boots and look at ships like altars you can approach but not touch. One uses the rail as if it were a lectern and practices a brief. Men, we are not here to prove a point. We are here to keep steel and flesh from sinking. Do your jobs. I'll handle the rest. That speech will never be given. It still becomes part of him. Monday. Evaluations. The room smells like pencil shavings and something tired. A senior officer scans the stack. He speaks in a tone men learn to translate. "Gentlemen, your scores are impressive, exceptional, unprecedented." He does not say the next part yet. He leaves it suspended in the air because power prefers suspense when it carries bad news. He moves on to areas for growth because a script must sound balanced even when the weight is lopsided. Experience at sea, time under watch, leadership exposure. The irony hums like a fluorescent tube. They need sea time to get command. They need command to get sea time. The circle closes with a bureaucrat's pen. Numbers again. 13 candidates, 4 months. Dozens of assessments, 0 demerits that matter. Count the praise. Now count the doors still closed. By noon, by evening, becomes by March, by April. Calendars turn. The tower of evidence grows taller, and the gap between merit and mandate grows wider. Not incompetence, not risk. Policy. There is a ledger the Navy keeps. Ships, tonnage, fuel, men. And there is another ledger it pretends not to keep. Custom, comfort, precedent, fear. On one side of the ledger, the math says, give these men a ship. Lives will be saved. Convoys will reach. Orders will be obeyed. On the other side, the human math is the institution does it. If we let them command now, what will that admit about yesterday? What will it demand tomorrow? Fear of precedent is a strange tide. It pulls harder than common sense, harder than statistics, sometimes harder than war. And so the day comes when numbers must meet a door. The door is a small briefing room, low ceiling, single window, paper on a clipboard that is already decided. One of the 13, he writes in his journal that night. Today, they praised us until the praise felt like a new kind of gravity, heavy. Then they added the word that crushes, however. He scratches the page harder than the pen requires. Ink blooms. He closes the book. By the time the sun drops, the math is still true. They're still the best class the station has seen. By the time the sun drops, the human is also true. They may still not be allowed to lead a single white sailor into a safe harbor. Two truths colliding. Silence between them. The day ends the way it began, breath turning to steam, discipline unbroken. But a question has moved in and refused to leave. If numbers can't move an institution, what can? The answer won't be found on a blackboard. It will be spoken once in a closed room where men who already know the truth will finally hear it out loud. Cut. Breathe. We go to the room. The door closes. A latch clicks that sounds louder than it should. Fluorescent hum. Paper breathes when it's turned. A coffee ring on the corner of authority. 13 chairs, 1 table. 2 officers at the head, faces carved into neutrality. No one stands at attention now. They were told to sit. They do, back straight anyway. The The senior officer begins with what bureaucracies believe is kindness. Gentlemen, you have done the Navy proud. Compliment is anesthesia. Praise is preface. He reads highlights like bullet points on a poster. Highest class average to date. Exemplary drill. Leadership potential. Repeatedly noted. He looks up. The room holds its breath. Accordingly, you will be commissioned as ensigns in the United States Naval Reserve. A muscle in a jaw relaxes. Someone lets out a breath he didn't know he was holding. Then the word arrives. It always arrives. However, silence grows a spine. Assignments will, at this time, be limited to non-combat administrative capacities. This is a sensitive matter. The department believes gradual integration is in the best interest of morale and efficiency. Morale, efficiency. Words that can be bent to any shape if you heat them with policy. One of the 13 raises a hand. He waits until the officer nods. Sir, with respect, our evaluations include command readiness. They do. And respectfully, the fleet needs officers. It does. Then why? The officer's eyes flick to the window, to the file, back to the man. This decision is made above my station. Above my station. A sailor knows how that sentence works. It means the order is yours to obey, but never yours to change. Another voice. Sir, permission to speak freely? A pause. A risk. Granted. We understood this was a pilot. We still understand. But a pilot without a flight is a mockery. We're asking for sea time. If we fail in view. If we pass, the Navy wins twice. The second officer shifts, softer tone. Son, I believe you. I do. But you don't understand the complexities. Complexities. Like waves you can't see but must pretend are there. A third voice, quieter. What are we allowed to command, sir? The answer is the size of a room. Classrooms, offices, training details. Not ships, not watches, not lives. The senior officer adds what he believes is consolation. This is not a no. It is a not yet. Not yet. The most efficient phrase ever built to delay justice. A chair leg scrapes, not rebellion, the sound of posture shifting under weight. One of them looks down at his hands, calluses from knots and ropework that no pen can smooth. He is doing the arithmetic of his own future and arrives at a remainder the system won't acknowledge. He says nothing. Another leans forward. Sir, if we wear the uniform without the authority, what exactly are we proving? The officer doesn't answer the question asked. He answers the question policy prefers. You are proving that this can be done without causing disruption. Disruption. The opposite of war, apparently. The room learns a new equation. Merit plus time command. Merit plus silence equals permission to exist. A thin laugh escapes, almost a cough. No one smiles. The senior officer gathers the papers, not because the meeting is over, but because props must be managed when the scene reaches its line. He says the sentence he will remember for years whether he wants to or not. Gentlemen, it's over. He means the decision is final. They hear the larger truth. It's over. Not we're in danger. Not this is difficult. Over. In that closed room, 13 men understand what the file meant when it blacked out command eligibility. It meant eligibility was never the issue. Permission was. The clock on the wall continues its ordinary work. Tick, tock. Nothing dramatic. History rarely uses symbols. They stand. They salute. Because dignity is not something you negotiate with when a system won't grant you the rest. At the door, one of them turns back, asks in a voice that keeps his throat from burning, Sir, when will not yet become now? The officer's answer is a blueprint of the institution. When the time is right. Right for whom? The question hangs unanswered like a flag in windless air. They file out. Footsteps that sound like men leaving a courtroom with a verdict everyone predicted and no one wanted to hear aloud. In the hallway, the fluorescent hum is the same as before. The world has not moved a single inch. They have. A whisper between two of them, not for drama, for breath. We'll serve anyway. Serve who? Silence answers. They will wear the gold bar. They will not be permitted a bridge. And yet the bridge of this story moves to them. Because the moment a man says, it's over, and means the lie of equality is finished, a different war begins. The one where you do your job perfectly and let the truth rot the policy from the inside. Cut, breathe. After this room comes the cost, not death in the water, a slower kind. Years of quiet, files mislabeled routine, praise without power, service without scope. We turn the page. We count that price. The press never printed their names. The Navy never sent a photograph. History doesn't erase men loudly. It buries them under paperwork. March 24th, 1944. The official announcement reads, 13 Negro candidates successfully complete officer training, assignments pending. Pending. That word did more damage than any torpedo. By April, orders arrived, and sealed, short, clean. Administrative posts, training commands, harbor duties, no combat, no ships, no men to lead. They wore their new insignia with the discipline they'd earned. They saluted officers who'd scored lower. They gave lectures on navigation to sailors who would command before them. Some nights, when the classrooms were empty, they would stand by the pier and watch ships depart. Men waving from decks they were never allowed to climb. The Navy called it successful integration in limited form. Integration, the kind you could hide behind closed doors. The files tell the rest in the coldest grammar. Program concluded. Results satisfactory. Expansion deferred. Deferred, another bureaucratic synonym for not yet. Years would pass. The war would end. Europe would burn itself into silence. The Pacific would cool. And 13 men would return home with a commission. And no story. America celebrated victory, but victory always speaks in selective past tense. It tells what it wants to remember. In Chicago, one of the 13, Samuel Gravely, stayed in uniform. He refused to leave the sea behind. He worked through every invisible wall, radar officer, operations, then command. Decades later, he would become the first black man to command a U.S. Navy warship. But in 1944, he was just another non-combat assignment. His story didn't sound like progress then. It sounded like waiting. Others left. Some returned to teaching, to engineering, to quiet neighborhoods where the title ensign was both a badge and a bruise. They had proven a system wrong, and the system couldn't afford to admit it. A letter found years later in an old footlocker reads, "We did not fail the Navy failed its own reflection." By 1946, desegregation debates began to crack the surface of military policy. The Tuskegee pilots had medals, the infantry divisions had records, the Navy had a silence. In 1948, President Truman signed Executive Order 9981, the end of segregation in the U.S. Armed Forces, a victory on paper. But by then, most of the Golden 13 had left. No public recognition, no ceremonies, just the quiet satisfaction that history someday would be forced to look back. Decades went by. 1950s, 1960s, the Cold War, Korea, Vietnam. The Navy sent men to the moon before it publicly acknowledged that these 13 existed. In 1987, the Golden 13 finally became a line in the Navy's official history. A photograph, long locked away in an archive, was released. 13 men in pressed whites standing at attention, the caption simple. First African American Naval Officers, 1944. No mention that they had never commanded, no mention of the blackout lines, no mention that the experiment succeeded and was buried anyway. Even the commendation came wrapped in irony. They were praised for breaking barriers, but the barrier had not been theirs. The Navy's public ceremony, 50 years too late, called it a moment of courage. A journalist asked one of the surviving members what he felt seeing his photograph finally displayed. He said quietly, "I felt old, but not bitter, because we always knew this day would come. The truth floats, like anything meant for the surface." He smiled, then added, "But it shouldn't take half a century for the tide to bring it up." The Navy issued commemorative coins. They placed a plaque at Great Lakes, polished brass, perfect light. Visitors walk past and take pictures. They see names. They don't see the black lines that once hid those names from command rosters. The irony lingers. An institution that refused to let them lead now teaches their story as leadership. And yet, that irony is also their victory. Because time corrodes denial faster than truth. Still, the cost never left the personal. 13 men went to war in a country that asked them to fight for democracy, but not trust them with authority. They returned to neighborhoods that called them boy in uniform. They paid rent in a nation that owed them a mortgage on dignity. The Navy's own post-war analysis file, declassified in 1991, includes one chilling line. Experiment deemed successful. Replication postponed indefinitely due to post-war. Demobilization. Demobilization. A word used to describe the ending of wars. Here it describes the ending of an idea. They fought without guns, but their battle rewired the institution from the inside out. Each promotion, each resignation, each silent salute left a mark that outlasted every ship of that era. And maybe that's the strange mathematics of justice. It takes a generation for an equation like that to balance. History records what power fears most, not rebellion, but proof. 13 men became that proof. And proof, once visible, never disappears again. They didn't sink ships or capture islands. They forced the U.S. Navy to face itself. They won no medals. They broke no bones. They broke precedent. 50 years later, when a black officer stood on the bridge of a destroyer with full command authority, he carried more than his crew. He carried a promise finally delivered. And somewhere, in the sound of the ocean against the hull, you can still hear the echo of 13 names that never got to give an order, but gave something heavier, the right to be there at all. Cut, pause, hold the silence, because silence is the last thing they ever wanted to leave behind. The file ends with a stamp. Closed to March 1944. No follow-up, no signatures after that, just the quiet of bureaucracy satisfied with itself. But history doesn't close with ink. It leaks. A single photograph remains. 13 men, shoulders squared, light falling from a window behind them. If you look closely, you can almost see the contradiction in the air. Pride, restraint, and something unspoken. Something that refused to die just because policy told it to. They called them the Golden 13. Gold, a metal that resists corrosion. But the system that surrounded them did not. The Navy moved on. Ships changed. Wars changed. Uniforms changed. But the question their silence left behind never did. Because what do you call freedom? When it comes with conditions, they were commissioned, saluted, praised, then hidden. They were proof that equality could exist, if only it stayed quiet enough not to disturb the room. The country called it progress. The Navy called it an experiment. The men themselves called it service. And service, real service, is the hardest kind of protest. They didn't curse the flag. They held it higher than the people who doubted them. They didn't break rank. They held the line so one day someone else could cross it. Look again at that photo. Every face carries a quiet sentence America still struggles to finish. We were ready. Ready to lead. Ready to fight. Ready to belong. But readiness doesn't matter when recognition arrives half a century late. Still, they stood, they taught, they waited. And in waiting, they changed what the word officer could mean. The Navy later called it inclusion, but inclusion isn't charity, it's debt. Listen, they passed every test, they broke every rule designed to keep them small. They carried the contradiction of a nation that preaches liberty and practices limits. They called it morale. They called it efficiency. They called it tradition. I call it fear. Fear of proof. Fear of a quality that performs too well to be denied. That fear, not hate, not ignorance, is what kept 13 men from command in 1944. And fear has always been the quiet enemy in American uniforms. The file ends there. But the silence in that classroom, that peer, that photograph, never did. They called it an experiment. I call it a mirror. You tell me. When a man earns the right to lead and a nation refuses to let him, who failed whom?